Hey guys, welcome back. Safe Space here on our 10 Tampa Bay YouTube page, where we are on a mission to normalize mental health in our society. I'm Ryan Bass. So glad to have you back. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Go do it right now. Hit the subscribe button. That way you guys are in the loop anytime we release a new episode here on our 10 Tampa Bay YouTube page. I'm so excited for today's episode because we're going to focus on something that's near and dear to my heart: athletes and mental health. And we're going to do it with a veteran sports psychologist who's been doing this for over a quarter century. So he is really, really well-versed in this topic here. I'm excited for you guys to meet Dr. Vince Ledato. He's a consultant for the Tampa Bay Rays and a number of other professional sports franchises as well. He's also the executive director of the National Sports Performance Institute. So he has been at this a long time, knows exactly what he's talking about. And he has such a unique perspective on how the landscape and acceptance of mental health in sport has really changed over the years. On this week's episode, we're going to get into how working on your mental health is just as important for athletes as it is to define and refine your physical health, and how the Rays have been so cutting edge in this area. We hear all the time about how good they are the Ray way on the field, but off the field in this mental health space, they've been pretty big in that department as well. We're also going to discuss the pandemic and the impact that that had on athletes and the most common struggle that Dr. Lodato identified in them while they were going through COVID restrictions, these bubbles, all the rules, the shutdowns, all that. And we're also going to examine how past behavior and the childhood, really the upbringing, can predict future behavior, and how Dr. Lodato has worked with athletes to reframe and to manage not just their anxieties, but their behavior as well. It's really a fascinating discussion. I am super grateful for Dr. Lodato and donating his time to this episode. So let's jump right into it. This week's episode titled Athletes Need Therapy Too with Dr. Vince Ledato. So excited to be joined by Dr. Vince Ledato here, who is taking some time out of his day to kind of normalize these athletes and the therapy that they go through as well. You know, I opened up in the last series, Dr. Lodato, about my fight through therapy. I've been going to therapy for 4 years, and you know, to read and to see and to hear that athletes that either I've looked up to, that I've covered, that I've worked with, go through therapy as well. It makes me feel like I'm more normal, right? And I think that's what this series and this conversation is going to be about with you. And I'm just so excited to jump into it with you.
Perfect. And thank you for having me. And I appreciate the opportunity to further this discussion and maybe shed some light on all of this.
Well, I just want to start off with your background, just so the viewers get an opportunity to understand the work that you've done, whether it be through NSPI, with the Rays, other franchises in sports, or just kind of take me through quickly your background and how you got to this place now where you're helping athletes, to perform at the height and at the best level that they can.
Well, I appreciate that. And briefly, at my background was at a master's in clinical social work and was in LCSW in private practice. Was affiliated with the healthcare organization that provides all the medical care for the Tampa Bay Rays. And when they were conceived and started, every major league team and organization was required to have a mental health point person, an employee assistance program type model for their players. That was 23 years ago. And I'll fast forward. Throughout these 23 years, obviously the role has grown and has evolved into assisting in other areas of player development, general health and well-being of players. For 12 of the last 23 years, was with 3 teams at once, consulting, traveling, pursued and finally finished my doctorate in sport and performance psychology, and obtained a national board certification as a certified mental performance consultant. So I kind of navigate that continuum from traditional mental health services to sport and performance psychology.
And what I find fascinating is you mentioned 23 years ago, you know, when this kind of got started, the stigma around mental health, if you will, has shifted dramatically in those 23 years. I mean, we're in a space now, Dr. Lodato, where it is much more accepted, widely accepted, truly, to see a therapist, to get help. You know, mental health, especially in the athlete realm, had kind of been taboo back in the day. Can you just expand on just the growth in that space and how it's become more normal to be able to seek treatment, not just physically for athletes, but now mentally?
Certainly. And you know, originally the great need was because of substance abuse and the need to provide intervention, triage service, crisis intervention, and treatment for those athletes that were struggling with substance abuse. And I'll credit a wonderful colleague, Dr. Charlie Marr with the Cleveland Indians, who said at one of our, as a member of the Big Sky Clinical Sports Psychology Group, said, mental health is not the search for psychopathology, mental illness, a DSM-5 diagnosis. It's general well-being and adaptive coping. It's life stance. It's optimistic hope, these kinds of things. So we've evolved from looking at this strictly as a crisis intervention to being more proactive, looking at these as, in the Tampa Bay Rays, we've modeled our program years ago through our player development as good persons, solid persons make solid performers. So that's been somewhat of the evolution of this, that we're looking at this not as mental health as, you need to kind of go over here and be treated, as much as it's a proactive approach along that continuum from life skills to performance, health and well-being.
And I like to hear, and again, substance abuse was something that we covered a lot, in sports, and again, was kind of looked down upon. But given the stressors and the expectation levels of some of these athletes, there have been ones that have struggled with substance abuse, but now it has evolved, as you mentioned, into a space where we're looking more now at development and working with these athletes early on, as opposed to just being, reactive to something, correct? Like that's kind of where this has evolved to, especially with your role now.
Certainly. And we've taken this view of knowing who the person is once they enter into professional sport. And again, lower levels of minor league baseball and development takes, a good few years to get to the major league level for the majority of players. We've looked at that, and it's not assessment of players has not been, do we select in or select out this player? It's who are we drafting? Who are we working with? And how do we help that person develop? And again, you're talking about the lower levels, 18 to 21-year-olds coming to professional baseball, or in professional hockey, 18, 19-year-olds who, leaving home, transitioning life, and be able to be, again, proactive in where do we need to put the work in to help these individuals develop mentally? What's their mental life, and where do we put that work in?
The Rays have always been cutting edge, whether it be through analytics, whether it be the Ray way, the way they scout and analyze players, the way they sign, free agency, the draft. I mean, they have really, truly revolutionized Moneyball, even in a way, to be so successful. But I think one of the key aspects, Dr. Lodato, and I credit you and I credit this organization for doing so, is truly investing in mental health and being at the forefront of that early on, not just, again, being reactive to it, but being proactive to it. How is this organization specifically? I know, again, you've worked across sport with multiple organizations, but how has this franchise embraced that, given you the opportunity to grow that, and just take me through why they've kind of been vanguards in this space more than others?
I have to credit the Rays in their broad-based approach. And what I mean by that, it's obviously sport at the highest level is about winning. But we have taken a multidisciplinary and quality assurance utilization review approach. What that basically means is I'm not the guru. We don't have experts. Nobody's out there to get credit, for a player's success or team success. It's multidisciplinary, much like you have a multidisciplinary healthcare team. So we've taken that approach, and we collaborate with someone of the analytics. We have a team of mental skills coaches. Mental skills coaches primarily focus on field, teaching the skills needed to perform on the field. We've been collaborative. We've been looking at what are we providing? Are we providing the highest quality of service? And are we utilizing our resources efficiently? And that's really been our approach. So it's no gurus, no experts, nobody gets credit, from the guys that do the analytics in terms of performance data, and all the way down to just the day-to-day, not real quantifiable measures when you're working with people. So,
look, if Eric Neander gets credit for helping put this team together, I got to give you credit for this team reaching the World Series last year. I mean, the mental health aspect of this, and in all seriousness, Dr. Lodato, you, the team, the on-field mental skills coaches, the guys behind the scenes, like, especially with what this last almost 2 years has brought us, it has been critical to be able to mentally survive this COVID-19 pandemic. Sure. And that plays into the success aspect of this organization. It might not be something that's talked about on a regular basis, but there's no question that the mental respect that this organization have and you all have, and the investment this team makes is what has also correlated and translated to success on the field.
Well, I appreciate that. And you mentioned COVID, and you mentioned my role. One of the unique things about licensed mental health professionals in sport that's critical for athletes, but also can set limits on some of that flow of information because of licensing laws, confidentiality, and informed consent. What that means is all of our athletes across all organizations throughout sport, regardless whether it's the NBA, the NHL, whatever, have access to licensed mental health professionals. That by statute provides confidentiality and privacy and privileged information. I've been subpoenaed for player records and have quashed those because it's privileged information and it's not in the, in the statute best interest of my client. That's critical for athletes to understand, that licensed mental health professionals that are provided by these teams give that protection to the athlete to come forward. You mentioned that early. What is it that, that stigma, to remove that stigma, but also provide that protection? That does create some limitations in the flow of information and what I would share or not share throughout the organization. The Ray, again, I can only speak to the Ray. I've been with other organizations in the past and solely with the Rays the last several years, have completely respected that and have never pressed for information and have never forced an issue on a player. They've only said, is this player getting what they need? And that's critical for athletes to understand to come forward. That being said, and I didn't mean to interrupt you. You mentioned COVID.
No, go ahead. No, and my brain's just moving here because I'm fascinated by this, but it really is. I mean, and this is called a safe space. This is what this platform that we're currently talking about is called. And you provide that for athletes. It's not just for, regular, Joe Schmo. I mean, this is, athletes have the same sort of space to be open and honest that we do.
Yeah. Have a long-standing relationship with the former farm director and director of player development, Mitch Lukovics. And when we looked at this over 20 years ago, how he wanted this to be, he said, I don't need to know. I don't want to know. Just do what you need to do and let's just take care of things. So I have that opportunity and that, freedom to make sure that we're providing that safe space for our athletes and Eric Neander as well. So that's critical. The last year was interesting. And we went through the playoffs. We were winning. We went through the playoffs, get to the World Series. And when you're winning, no one wants to create a negative vibe. No one wants to talk about the stresses of COVID and being in a bubble and playing without fans. Fast forwarding to the present. Yesterday, I don't know if you saw in Wimbledon, the young lady had a panic attack on the court. And I just heard it briefly. And the announcer referenced COVID and how athletes had not played in front of crowds like that and under pressure in so long. And there's this concept of, self-presentational theory in sport. You're performing in front of fans, parents, spouses, the media, your coaches, teammates, the other team. Everything is evaluated, scrutinized, judged. COVID removed a lot of folks from that for a period of time, and then played without fans, and then played in a situation where you dream your whole life about playing in the World Series, and you can't enjoy all the other things that come along with achieving at that level. So there were some unique stresses, and we're just learning about it now. And to Major League Baseball's credit and the commissioner's office, we've had open discussions throughout the summer on these things. We didn't know what we were getting into, and now we're realizing it. And the impact, again, back to the impact of mental health and well-being, that doesn't necessarily mean reach the level of a diagnosis and treatment, but just that stress and how athletes navigate that is quite unique. The environment and what the demand is.
I want to stay in the space of the pandemic because it was unique. I mean, we hadn't seen something like this in a century, and it impacted all aspects of life. Work from home, what we're doing right now became normal. In the athlete space, it was tough because, Vince, I've spoken with a number of athletes. I had an opportunity to interview a bunch. We've been doing it over Zoom for quite some time now, and to just listen to how they've tried to battle through this. And again, this whole point of this conversation is kind of breaking down those walls of seeing athletes as these immortal creatures, because they're not. They are mortal. They're just like you and I. I mean, they have emotions, they have feelings, they have stressors, they have anxieties, they battle depression. What for you, from what you saw, and I don't want to get into one specific athlete in general, but sure, what would you say was the most common struggle for athletes within this past year dealing with COVID-19?
As a general theme, it was lack of freedom to be able to enjoy going to a city for 3 days, your favorite restaurant, going to dinner with your buddies after and your teammates, returning to your room basically in isolation. Team sport, the team culture, that bonding, being able to get together and process the game, win or lose, after, really limited a lot of those opportunities. That ability to enjoy your sport with what comes besides just the 9 innings on the field. And that was difficult. And let's just don't limit this to players, staff.
Yeah.
We're in the same situation. The bubble, so to speak, that really did impact on just that, again, that joy, that pleasure, being able to be free to express. A lot of it also became somewhat of a vigilance on guard. And you think about ourselves, when this started, the first time you went out with a mask and seeing people with masks, and, you touch the door to go into the store, and then you're looking for the hand sanitizer. It took a lot of mental work just to navigate things that we would do, unconsciously, or, things that were more associative kinds of things. You just do it without thinking. It became very cognitive in how they were navigated.
It changed everything, right? I mean, it changed the way we think, the social skills we have. It was such a emphasis on not getting the virus, especially in the athletes world, in the bubble, where you don't want to give it to your teammate. You don't want to be the cause of canceled games. You don't want, there was such a pressure on that sense too, of trying to have your own personal responsibility. And I feel like those social situations change. And I want to make sure that those watching don't make light of this. There might be those people thinking, well, boo-hoo, these athletes couldn't, go out to their restaurants, or couldn't go out to the club, or couldn't enjoy, hanging out with friends or what. But that's part of the release. That is part of what comes with this. There's such a focus mentally for athletes on trying to perform, that all that stuff around it is somewhat of that release, to be able to disconnect from the game for a minute, or be able to recharge and reset, to be able to focus, perform, do what's necessary to be at the top of your profession, but also be at the top of your personal life too. How much did it affect players not being able to be around their families too? Because I'm sure that was really difficult.
Very much so.
Staff too, and not just players, but obviously staff organizationally.
Very much so. You play in the World Series. Generally, you would have 20 people there from your family where they would be in. You'd go to dinner after, and you would share that experience. So it's not just, as you said, people would look at this and say, oh, I'm sorry you couldn't go out to dinner with your buddies. Being able to share the pinnacle of your career with those that are most important to you, other than, a Zoom call, FaceTime, maybe seeing them at the stadium for the limited number that could come, but not being able to have that contact with each other. When we think about athletes, we sort of present this double bind. It's just a game. And then we turn around and poor performance for the majority of players. Not everybody, plays 10, 15 years in the big leagues. You're one bad game away from being sent down, they live with that. When you think about that, and we talk about in a lot of work, and what we look at with these athletes is, what's your athletic identity? Is it healthy and balanced and grounded? Do you have life balance? If your whole identity is tied into your sport, your sense of self-esteem and self-efficacy is tied into the winning and losing, and how you feel about yourself, and you view, your identity in the bigger context. So a healthy athletic identity is critical. Not being able to have those other areas of your life, like spending time with family and going to dinner and having your spouse travel with you, or these kinds of things, really put almost a very narrow unidimensional focus on, you're an athlete and don't do anything to upset our season, our team, our winning. Now, that wasn't overtly imposed on these athletes, but it certainly was part of the culture and environment. So a lot of what kept these athletes balanced in terms of good life balance in their identity, we just didn't have access to those things, which created a whole nother level of just stress. It's all about not upsetting the game and this and that,
You mentioned self-efficacy, because that point hit home with me, and that identity, because I don't think that's just an athlete thing. Like, a lot of us identify to our professions. We identify who we are based on what we do. How important is it to kind of pull that apart, separate that a little bit? And I know we talk specifically about the athlete world, but just normalize it for me in a second, for just like you and I, to pull ourselves apart from what we do and separate it. That way our identity isn't locked in just to what we do for a job. And then if you, for some reason, lose your job, boom, there goes your self-identity, and there goes the, hitting rock bottom, if you will.
Sure. And I'll preface my answer with, a lot of our minor league players hadn't really played in a meaningful game since the fall of 2019, until they returned to spring training and can play in a season now. So it was quite a while, in an entire summer, where they might have been home, could spend time with family, did things. We just had 4th of July, play baseball games. Last year, a lot of those minor league players could be home with family, and some of them have discussed, I realize there's more to life than baseball. So I preface my answer with that in mind, that the sport ethic demands you make sacrifices for the game and to achieve excellence. What that means is you're going to miss Mother's Day and birthdays, and not be able to go home for someone's wedding, or because you're playing, especially in baseball, we play every day, right? So, that sport ethic demands that you make those sacrifices. A healthy athletic identity means you accept those and embrace those as what it takes to pursue excellence. Self-efficacy is more durable belief when things don't go well in your sense of self. And we talk a lot about mental toughness in sport. And we hear a lot of motivational sayings, and run through walls, and show movie clips from Rocky and these kind of things. But what does that really mean? We used to think mental toughness, to get back to self-efficacy, was a precursor to mental health. But now, and there was an interesting article came out a few years ago where mental health is really a precursor to mental toughness. It's your cognitive, behavioral, and affective factors. It's your thoughts and mental life, your self-talk, your belief, your self-efficacy, and how you manage emotionally. And it's behaviorally being consistent in routines and setting goals and managing off-field behavior. So mental health, if you think about it, is cognitive, affective, and behavioral. Your thoughts, your feelings, and behaviors. That's a precursor to mental toughness, which is more durable in coping with sport, as opposed to, formulaic sayings, if you don't conquer your fears will conquer you. Well, what does that mean? Right? So we're looking at mental health as a precursor to mental toughness, which leads to self-efficacy. Confidence is contextual. And when I look at the personality and psychological profiles of athletes, highly perfectionistic athletes that also have a self-assurance and self-efficacy and manage emotionally tend to pursue perfection, striving for perfection, knowing it's unattainable. Those athletes that are perfectionistic but have a low self-efficacy, self-assurance, are anxious, worrisome, they're going to ruminate. They're going to have perfectionistic concerns and obsessive worry and things. So again, that's sort of not to get too clinical in this, and but that's it all fits together.
I love that aspect, because it doesn't just apply to athletes too, Dr. Lodato. Like, my dad always told me this quote, and it's a quote that I've always lived by. If you can conceive it and believe it, you can achieve it. Right. Like, and I think that quote in itself by Napoleon Hill, it starts up here. Like, it starts with the belief. It starts with being able to, as you mentioned, self-talk, manage your emotions, set goals, your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors. That kind of becomes the precursor to your mental health, to your performance. Can you, from what you've spoken with an athletes, can you give me an example of what you've maybe worked through with them, or how they've been able to master that craft, and how we can apply it as a normal, not high performing athlete, human being? How can we apply some of that to better improve ourselves in our own mental health?
Well, you mentioned, if you can see it, you can achieve it. And that's an important concept. What's your vision of the future? How do you get there? And again, you can see yourself 2 years down the line as a AA player, making the major league roster and playing in the big leagues. If your self-efficacy and sense of self is dependent on your last game, 4 bats, or last couple of innings you pitched, and it's brittle, let's say, what do you do to get there? Some days I'm going to train and follow our dietitian's recommendations for nutrition. I'm going to get to bed early, and then some days I'm going out, not me personally, but athletes out after the game, drinking beer and eating chicken wings and staying out all night. Again, it's a self-assessment. You have to give yourself an honest self-appraisal. Again, some of the athletes we've seen in their profiles are maybe moderate in their level of self-assurance, but when you really interview them and drill down, they have an honest self-appraisal. They have a durable self-efficacy, but they also know, where do I need to make adjustments in my life? My role is to help sort that out and provide context and direction on how you do that, rather than just start throwing things at them and say, well, do this, do that, and whatnot. I like a good assessment. I want to know the person as much as the performer. Where do we target? Maybe your self-talk is solid, but you're inconsistent in your routines and behavior. Well, we're going to take more of a behavioral approach, or maybe you're really consistent, but we have to work more on emotional management and self-regulation in terms of your emotions. So it's targeted interventions.
It's really fascinating to kind of peek behind the curtain and see, how you can work specifically with these athletes on areas that they might not be as strong on, because we always think of bigger, faster, stronger, right? These are the biggest and fastest and strongest guys on the planet in their respective sport, but there are aspects of their mental health that they still need to work on. And so I wanted to dive a little bit more on that, as far as the ups and the downs, because there are going to be, highs and there's going to be lows, especially in the athlete world. Randy Arozarena had one of the greatest postseasons we'd ever seen in the sport. And then there's going to be days where maybe he goes, 3 for 54, and he has a stretch like that. How do you specifically help those athletes battle those extreme highs and extreme lows? And I know it is cliche. They always say, you don't ever want to get too high. You don't ever want to get too low. Those words can kind of get lost in translation though. So how specifically mentally do you work through some of that, what you see in sport?
I always have to have a good assessment.
So it's different for each guy, basically.
It is individualized. And I'm looking at history, and I'm looking at, have you had a 5 for 55 stretch before? What did you do to get through that? Resiliency, and most of that research in sport comes from prior research on at-risk youth. Why did some kids survive, horrible traumatic circumstances and thrive, and some didn't? And I want to know background. I want to know what history is there. What are your strengths? How do we maximize those? And where do we put the work into where there may be deficits? So again, it's individualized based on assessment. And then where do we start? History, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Many athletes, because they're gifted and have exceptional talent, have been able to get by on that through lower levels. Well, the game catches up. Some of those athletes haven't had to work at it or experience failure. And it's interesting, when I completed my dissertation, I looked at personality profiles that we had accumulated over the draft for several years. And I got the draft data from the commissioner's office, which is published. It was in a Baseball America study several years ago. And just in broad terms, without having the exact numbers in front of me, if you look at talent in first round draft picks, we assume they all have a level of talent to play in the major leagues. That's why they're first rounders. I think it was somewhere around 70% get to the major league level. But that number dropped to just over, I think, 5.5% play 3.5 years or more.
Wow.
And what I wanted to know myself was why? What is it about those core traits where some have nice long careers and some get there because they have talent, and they're going to get there because of talent, but they're not durable, they're not robust. And a lot of those were so self-confident and self-assured and relaxed and composed, and they had never experienced failure.
Wow.
And, the cliche in baseball, it's based on failure, right? The game. So, shortstop bobbles a ball or throws it away, and first thing on the scoreboard is E6,
Error,
right?
Yeah.
The whole world knows it right away.
You did it, shortstop. Yeah. Your fault.
Jordan, missed a 3-pointer. Okay, he's going to get the next one right away, right? The game just keeps going on. So, that kind of a thing. I wanted to know that. And I wanted to know, what was it about late round picks that maybe weren't graded out as high talent, but later picks, 20th rounders. What was it about their psychological makeup and history where they were just more resilient, gritty, durable? So again, that's sort of a long answer to your question.
No.
There's no simple answer, but what is the history? What contributed to the development of that personality in the context of sport?
One thing I picked up on from your awesome long answer there is childhood background. And you mentioned at-risk youth, because a lot of we do a lot, and we see a lot of these features and stories on, kids that maybe have come from, struggling neighborhoods, or, a single mother or parent, and have risen to this level of excellence and success. You mentioned that. How much does that play into it? How much does, what the child, the upbringing, the way that they were raised maybe comes into play here? Or how they work through how they were raised.
Certainly. When just in a general sense, you asked me a question. I'm not going to give you a short, pithy answer. I'll give you some context.
Go ahead.
When you look at history and you look at history of trauma or kids that grew up in stressful home environments, alcoholic parent, divorce, poverty, emotional or even physical kinds of abuse, these whatever it might be, they become highly reactive emotionally. In a general sense. Okay? That can transfer to the high pressure of sport, emotionally active or reactive, protective coping skills, and a lot of anticipatory anxiety or worry. You talk to not just athletes, but, young people and young adults in general, or people that are in, receiving counseling and therapy. If you come home and you don't know if there's going to be a chaotic, emotionally charged home environment, you become a little vigilant and anticipatory, and what if, and what's today going to be like? Well, that becomes part of who you are. And in the world of sport, where everything is scrutinized, trust, team dynamic, where do I fit today in this bigger picture? I mean, a lot of that carries over and transfers over. So again, my clinical background and performance psych background and all that kind of interacts to sort out what's really going on here underneath the tip of the iceberg. When you look at those at-risk kids in trauma history, and trauma can be what we call small t trauma, just a series of smaller, less, not necessarily physical or sexual abuse or these kind of things, or, those things become sort of piled on one or the other if it's pervasive throughout your development. And you take that into your adult life and who you are as a person, as a professional, regardless of your field. So we do consider that. What's the history and how does it impact?
A couple of things here. I got a few more minutes with you, and I just want to hit on this one last point, because anticipatory anxiety is something that a lot of people struggle with, not just athletes. Mm-hmm. Me personally, I get anxious of a meeting that could be coming up, and possibly anticipating the worst or thinking the worst can happen. It seems to be dates in your mind. You're anxious about, what's going to happen when we get there, or what's going to happen 6 months down the road. How common do you see that in sport? How common do you see that within athletes, the anticipatory anxiety, and how can we fight it? How can me, the average Joe, like an athlete, work through that anticipatory anxiety so it doesn't, plague you and hurt you, basically?
Sports are emotionally charged, and we talk about pressure. Playing in a World Series is different than maybe playing in a game earlier in the year where you're, not every game is important, obviously, but, different importance is placed on that by the external expectation. And then you anticipate that, and then you begin to get aroused, and then you get your energy and excitement level. There's a point where it becomes anxiety provoking, which can be apprehensive, avoidant, doubtful, skeptical, and it can be embraced as arousal, excitement, approach, sort of an orientation. So really helping the athlete differentiate between, we throw anxiety around as a broad term. But what is anxiety in a cognitive, worrisome kind of sense, and a somatic reaction? Heart rate speeds up and muscle tension and sweaty palms, these kind of. So at what point can the athlete contain it as healthy excitement, anticipation, can't wait to get out there? It's opportunity to perform at my best. It's an approach motivational orientation as opposed to an avoidant orientation because it's anxiety and apprehension and doubtful. So it's a cognitive kind of reframing. It's what's the athlete's perception of that. And then again, back to cognitive affective behavioral, what do you do to prepare? What are your pregame routines? Are they purposeful, productive, outcome-oriented kinds of things? And how do you manage emotionally? Heart rate, respiration, these kind of things. So then it's very targeted, again, back to cognitive behavioral affective factors. So is it, like the kid that can't sleep before Christmas because he's so excited? Well, okay, that's a great thing, right? I can't
right?
wait. It's going to be a good thing.
Yeah.
Versus, oh my God, Christmas is horrible. And, dad's going to get drunk and trash the tree. Sorry. But that kind of a thing. So at what point can we help the athlete look at it as embracing the energy that's needed to perform at that level versus the tipping point where it becomes avoidant and debilitating?